Welcome everybody to our Leaders in Housing Counseling call. Welcome everybody to our Leaders in Housing Counseling call. We are doing a special edition today. I think we went through a time of some reflection and thinking after the George Floyd killing and massive demonstrations around the country, and in this whole process of really evaluating the issues of race in our culture and our time, we felt like it wasn't appropriate to proceed the way we had been in the past, and that we needed to stop, pause, reflect, and think of what the next appropriate step is. And I have to say a big thank you to the many people who contributed to this conversation and to thinking about where the next steps are. Special shout out to Melody for having raised critical issues and for Ellie for pulling it together. And the idea is that we want to have a sort of deeper, more race-conscious conversation about our work and how it fits into the world. And so we've done some work to make that happen today. Would love to know what your thoughts and evaluations are afterwards. There'll be opportunities to jump in on your own as well. These are critical issues for us to reflect deeply on our work and who we are and our sense of mission. So very glad that we're doing this. So I'm really going to hand the call over to Ellie and then to the panelists who are really, I think, very valuable voices in all this.
Thanks, Bruce. Hi, everybody. I think, as you can see, we're doing things a little bit differently today, and that our panel is on camera because we really wanted to make this a personal conversation. So we wanted you to be able to see them speaking with each other. And we also, later in the call, we want to open the lines up and allow you all to speak, for anybody to make any comments or share any thoughts that you have. And so the best way for you to do that would be to, if you raise your hand, I'll be monitoring that and I can open up your line so that you can speak. I will be opening up the lines one at a time and I'll let you know when I open your line. Another option, if you're not comfortable speaking, please feel free to comment, ask questions in the chat box, in the question box. I'll be monitoring that as well so that I can let the panelists know if there's thoughts that you all are sharing that way. And so with that, I want to just move right into the panel, and I would like to introduce Tamara Raspberry with NCRC. Tamara is the HR person for NCRC, and she has a lot of background in diversity and inclusion, and she agreed to moderate our panel today. And so I'm going to turn this over to her. Tamara.
Thanks so much, Ellie, and thank you for having me here today. I'm very excited about moderating this panel today. I want to get right to it. So first, let's start off with some introductions of our panel. We're going to go in alphabetical order by last name, and I just ask that each of you give kind of a brief bio of yourself so that everyone knows who's talking today and what your specialty is. We'll start with Ibijoke Akimbowale.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Tamara mentioned, my name is Ibijoke Akimbowale. I'm the director of the Housing Counseling Network at NCRC. My team is a national intermediary program. We work in conjunction with our training academy to provide great housing counseling resources to organizations throughout the country.
Excellent, excellent. Let's move on to Ms. Angela Davidson. We can't hear you, Angela.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angela Davidson, and I work as a program director and a housing counselor with Neighborhood Housing Services of Brooklyn. Neighborhood Housing Services of Brooklyn is a nonprofit organization that deals primarily with all housing-related issues, from first-time home buyers to foreclosure and post-purchase. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Simone Griffin.
Hi there, can you hear me? Perfect. I'm Simone Griffin with Home Free USA. I Our organization is based in the DC metro area, and so my work centers around our 53 affiliate partners across the country.
Thank you. Lee Lester Holmes. We can't hear you, Lee.
And I was looking going, don't do that. My name is Lee Lester Holmes. I am the CEO and founder of Ubuntu Institute of Learning. I work around the country doing training with nonprofit housing agencies and counselors. I focus on nonprofit sustainability and training.
Thank you so much. And Mr. David Young.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Young, and I'm with Housing Action Illinois, which is based in Chicago. And we are a statewide organization that assists our members with housing issues throughout our state. We are also a housing counseling intermediary with the Comprehensive Housing Counseling Program, and we have 33 sub-grantees in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Missouri.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So let's get right into this conversation. 2020 has been a year that none of us could have predicted, right? Starting with the coronavirus pandemic, which has been devastating, with the COVID-19 virus hitting Black communities particularly hard. And now we have all of the civil unrest following the killings of Black people by police and private citizens alike. I wanted to ask you, Ibijoke, can you share how these events have affected your work and the agencies that you work with?
Absolutely. I think initially it hits us as individuals, and we think about how we show up in society. I tell people all the time, I mean, we get to walk within our various communities, but we bring all of who we are to work. And so what we see in the news with the unfortunate killing of George Floyd, and even now a lot of the ongoing civil unrest between the protests and the riots, and most recently what we are seeing across the country is lynchings happening in various communities. And so as individuals, I think, for me, it definitely was a period of pause and reflection, and being honest about how I am impacted, checking in with my team and seeing on how this impacts them as mothers, as fathers, as sons, as allies in this community and the work that we do. And then, of course, a banner conversation about how do we show up and still do this work given all that is going on? What is the best way that we can present ourselves? And so a lot of it has really been about what is the appropriate response. And so in this period in time, I know I've spoken with a number of organizations and their leadership on how do we navigate this? What do we say to our staff? What do we, folks are even being very transparent about the conversations that they're having at home. What do they say to other organizations and their partners in this work? And I think the general consensus really has been is that you don't remain silent. Not remaining silent while there's just so much happening in the community that affects, everyone and their core sense of humanity. And obviously, on the heels of the coronavirus, what at a time that has caused a lot of heightened anxiety. I think we've all seen the numbers and the statistics regarding Americans suffering with anxiety and depression as a result of this increased isolation. And now to see this great civil unrest, we really have to take a step back and really address each other from a person-to-person perspective, acknowledging folks for where they are and coming together to create strong messaging, especially around how do we move forward from here? How does our work impact and affect the change that we really want to see? So that's really been the space that I've been in, and a lot of my peers as well, Tamara.
Thank you so much. Angela, I know that you work directly with individuals who are facing foreclosure and have other housing counseling needs. How has COVID-19 and the current civil unrest that we're experiencing impacted your clients? And then also, can you speak to how having to work remotely due to COVID-19 has impacted your ability to provide services?
So, as you stated, we are working remotely and we haven't had a lot of interaction with homeowners, just over the phone. So I think not being able to speak to someone face to face has really taken away our capacity to deal with, what they're dealing with. When we talk to them on the phone, we're really not getting what they're saying. We're not seeing the body language. We're not, we're hearing it in the voices, right? So we're hearing the hurt because, as you know, minority communities have been the worst hit by COVID. And, New York is no less than anywhere else. But of course, a lot of the clients that we serve are minority clients. I know we're seeing them. They're hurt by COVID. They're fearful, right? A lot of them are in foreclosure. They're not sure what's going to happen once the foreclosure moratoriums are lifted and the courts are open back. And then having this unrest, worrying about their sons and their husbands going out every day on the street and having to worry, are they going to be coming home? So now we're seeing the disparities come to light. And people are really talking about how they're feeling. They're asking, what can they do? And we as an organization, we're trying to be counselors. We are doctors. We're divorce attorneys. We deal with every aspect of a homeowner's life when they come in and talk to us. And not being able to be there for them in a physical way where we can see each other face to face is really painful. It's painful for us as an organization, and I know it's painful for the homeowners that we deal with, because a lot of these homeowners are seniors, right? And they're not computer savvy. They don't have the infrastructure in their homes, and they live, on top of each other, so to speak. And so, of course, COVID is going to affect them more than anybody else. And then the debt now leads to that homeowner dying, who then takes on this mortgage, right? How can their children survive? Is it the displacement, shelters, all the services that they need now, healthcare, how do we deal with that? So we're really suffering not being able to see each other face to face.
Thank you. That actually is an excellent segue into the question I was going to ask Simone, because Simone, I know that you have spoken about the interconnectedness of the issues that we're facing now, how it's not just about social justice, and I know there's been a significant economic impact on people as well. Angela just really mentioned a lot of examples of that. One thing I heard you say is that housing counselors are like financial first responders. Can you elaborate on that?
We are completely first responders in this space. First of all, a lot of the injustice that has occurred that we're seeing today is in the financial sector. Regardless of where it started, I mean, we can go back in history to all the ways that people of color have been kicked out of the wealth building process. So our work in this industry is to change that, is to close that gap. I mean, we're seeing the racial wealth gap today, and trust me, it is not for a lack of desire. We've got there are some incredibly smart people who are making major waves in their lives, but they have never been taught the fundamentals of personal finance or home buying or whatever. And they've got good jobs. And so let's not act like, unfortunately, so much of this country can easily think, well, they just don't want better. Or, they've never tried. Or if you just stop spending, and the media unfortunately does not help. If you stop spending over here and stop doing this and stop doing that, then maybe you'd have. How about the fact that we're continuously locked out over and over and over again? And this is why our work is so valuable, because if we don't sit there as the experts, as mortgage industry experts, and we say, actually, no, this person should completely qualify for their mortgage and for a mortgage here. And if we don't go here, don't worry, we'll go somewhere else. We'll figure out where they go, because there is no reason that this family should not be in a home of their own based on their finances, based on their credit or whatever. And nobody is perfect. We all have some work to do, but you won't know how to do that work without homeownership advisors, like all the people on the phone, that we all represent this industry. So we are vitally important to closing the racial wealth gap. And that is activism in itself. A lot of people have asked me, and I've talked to a lot of people, and look, guys, I am not the one to have race conversations, but it's interesting that in this month, I've had tons of them. And the big question is that I'm getting, especially from non-Black people, is what can I do? How can I help? And really, if you are on the front lines like we are, this is your activism. You and I'm not saying don't go to a protest. You can go to a protest, but when you come back, just know Monday through Friday, you are fighting to make sure that this wealth gap is closed. That is part of the justice, of just the equality and all that stuff. If you are, and I know everybody in here is typically in the nonprofit space, but if you're in the for-profit space, you just make sure that you are serving via diversity, having diversity in your advisory committees and in your boards, and serving your audience, making sure that your audience is expanded to meet all of America, not just the majority. And there's nothing wrong. We're expanding the pie. This whole conversation is about expansion. It is not about taking from this person to give to that person. So that's why it's really critical. First of all, I just want to honor and say thank you to everybody on the call, because without you, there are so many people who will never be able to build wealth. And so you guys are jumping in and saying, I'm going to do my part. And that's all we can do is our part. So thank you for that. And yes, we've got to just continue this momentum.
Thanks so much, Simone. So y'all know I'm not a housing counseling person, I'm an HR person, but as an HR professional, I can definitely relate to the challenge of having to navigate maintaining my own emotional well-being while also trying to serve the people that I support at work. I wanted to ask Lee, how can agencies in their communities be empowered with the resources they need to take care of their employees as well as the people they serve?
Thank you. Very good question. And I actually took quite a bit of time to think on this, because in the training space, we often get asked, like, what can we do for our staff? What can we as counselors and executive directors do for our community? And so in doing some research, fortunately, there's quite a few resources out there, especially in the space of diversity and inclusion. And so I kind of echo what Simone's talking about. We need to look in our own house. Right? We need to start internally and see how we can start to affect some change. And I agree, go to your protest, absolutely. Talk to as many people as you can, but look and see who's on your board. Look and see who's at your executive level. And I was really surprised recently, I saw a statistic that said Black females are really kept out of that space, of the C-level, the C executive level in nonprofits, which really surprised me. Like, we know the number's dismal in corporations, but in nonprofits, their boards are still lacking in diversity. So that's something we can do as nonprofits. Let's look in the mirror before we start talking to other folks about these issues. And then I also found there's a website you can go to called Diversity Inclusion Center. They have a lot of resources. I actually reached out to a colleague of mine, Aubrey Blanche, on LinkedIn, and she has a wonderful talk on YouTube about ways you can promote diversity and inclusion. The information is out there. The Council on Nonprofits puts out an article called Blueprint for Diversity in the Workplace. So those are good places to start. Have those conversations with your staff. And if you only have one Black staff member, don't make them the point person for all things race. That's a very uncomfortable position to be in, and they shouldn't have to carry that burden. Educate yourselves, talk to other people. I mean, bring them in the conversation, because I'm one of those people. I serve on a board right now. I won't say the name, but it's 40 plus people. Almost all of them are old white men. And guess who got appointed the chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee? Me. But I do it proudly because I was able to bring on some more people of color, and we're actually looking at making some change, not only to our board, but how we represent in the community, and how we get other folks to come on board who don't look like the ones that just represent our board. And really, when you're thinking about board, I do a lot of board training, they should represent your community. The whole Black Lives Matter is kind of talking about that our police forces should represent our community. Well, so should our nonprofit leaders as well. I mean, we do a great job with our staff. our staff reflects our community for sure, but when it comes to executive leadership, we really need to take a step back and say, are we doing all we can to promote this? One other, USC actually has a really wonderful blog where they have, if you Google it, it says Diversity Workshop Guide to Discussing Identity, Power, and Privilege. And they have some wonderful tools there as well. And I'll share that with Ellie so she can send it out to the group. And I apologize, Ellie, for not getting that to you sooner. But I wanted to be very intentional and make sure that the resources I shared would be useful. But I would say if you get nothing, just look in your own wheelhouse, in your own house, and start from there. And then reach out to your community leaders, because it's hard for us to speak in a place of knowledge, understanding, and compassion if we're not doing it ourselves.
Thank you so much. You actually also answered the next question that I was going to ask about. No, it's fine. I was going to bring up how the Black people were kind of being asked to be the de facto D&I experts in their organizations just because they happen to be Black, and what could we do to help with that? But you gave that answer already, so thank you very much for that.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
Just really quick. And one thing that I brought up in my subcommittee is when we got started, and it was 3 Black people and like 7 white people, and I said, this needs to be a safe space for us. We need to feel supported by you. We need to feel free to share our truth and not be judged or criticized for it. And I need you guys to understand what I'm talking about when I say that. And I got so many responses from them individually. Like, they didn't say it in the group, but they emailed me directly and said, I really appreciate that. So, the hard conversations, although they can be difficult to get into, I think they're cathartic once you start having those conversations and people are like, okay, I can say what I think because I'm not going to be judged, but I can learn from it. So yeah, all right, I'll shut up now.
No, thank you so much. That's an excellent point. This conversation would be incomplete if we didn't discuss disparity. David, I know I heard you say something before, something like for every $100 invested in white communities, 12 cents or something like that is invested in Black communities. While that information is definitely disheartening to me, I could honestly say I'm not that surprised. Can you speak more about community investment or lack thereof and how it relates to the events that we're seeing now?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and I'm actually going to tell a little story about myself, because I think that it will help to, as Simone mentioned about disparities. So on June 8th, WBEZ, our local NPR affiliate, released a report done in conjunction with City Bureau called Where Banks Don't Lend, which looks at mortgage lending in white and minority neighborhoods in Chicago between 2012 and 2018. And one of the major takeaways from this study was that for every dollar in mortgage investment made in white neighborhoods, there was 12 cents invested in Black neighborhoods and 13 cents invested in Hispanic Latinx neighborhoods. And between 2012 and 2018, there were $57 billion in mortgage loans made in Chicago. And that's billion with a B. So while the study that I just talked about focuses on Chicago, I'm sure that if we did research in other cities, in Oakland and St. Louis and New York City, in DC, that we'd find similar lopsided investment wherever we looked. So after reading this study, it really gave me an opportunity to think. So if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, I just want to tell you a story. So in 1956, my grandparents purchased a 4-bedroom, 1-bath wood frame house on the east side of Buffalo, New York for about $12,000. Now, I included the words east side because that's code. So many of you on this screen know what I'm talking about. So $12,000 in 1956 is worth $113,000 in 2020 dollars. So the house was close to schools. and close to a wide Frederick Law Olmsted designed greenway that connected Humboldt and Delaware parks. What my grandparents didn't know was that in 1937, the Homeowners Loan Corporation classified the area as yellow. And so those of you who have seen the maps, you know the colors were blue, green, yellow, and red. And yellow means, or meant, definitely declining. And the neighborhood was considered declining because you were seeing more immigrants and more African Americans moving into the neighborhood. So that was a caution to persons making loans to be very careful about investments in those areas. So my grandparents, despite that classification, were able to secure an FHA-backed 15-year mortgage for their house, unlike many other people in their situation who were denied loans or ended up purchasing homes at inflated rates or fees. My grandparents also didn't know that within a few years of purchasing their home, that the greenway that was such an attraction would be replaced by a sunken, multi-lane highway designed to quickly convey workers from downtown to their homes in the suburbs. My grandparents paid off their home in 1971. So with that, they were able to use all that equity to transfer wealth to the next generation, right? When my grandparents died in 1998, I got the responsibility of caring for the house because I was the only family member that was living and working in Buffalo, to make significant repairs to the property. Many of my neighbors were unable to secure bank financing due to low appraisals or to a minimum loan size, and the conditions of neighboring properties continued to decline. So I left Buffalo in 2003, and I sealed the house instead of renting it out because I didn't want to be an absentee landlord. Unable to keep the vacant property insured, I put it on the market in 2007. In 2008, I accepted the only offer I received at $19,000, and that was far less than the balance on the mortgage. So I had to accept a short sale. It damaged my credit, but I paid back the difference between the sales proceeds and the mortgage balance. Fast forward to 2014, I'm in Chicago. I purchased a traditional brick bungalow for $197,000 with an FHA mortgage, just like my grandparents. Unlike my grandparents, I'm fully aware at the time of purchase of the HOLC classification when I purchased. Now, we all know that those classifications have long since been made illegal, but the maps are still available. And so can you guess what my neighborhood color was? Yellow. Although this form, as I said, of discrimination was outlawed many years ago, most of our minority communities still wrestle with the impact of redlining to this day. So with the interest rates low in 2020, I thought this is the perfect time to finance and get rid of the MIP. And according to Redfin, the value of my home has steadily increased and is now worth $225,000. So that means that my LTV is definitely below 80%. So I called my loan officer and said, let's refinance this house. My loan officer then calls me back and says, well, according to Zillow, your house is only worth $180,000. Now I want to repeat that. So Redfin says the house is worth $225,000. Zillow says the house is worth $180,000. So it means that my house has actually lost value since purchase. So either I have about $18,000 of equity, if you use the Zillow number, or $63,000 using the Redfin number. So we were told that once we switched over to computer algorithms, it was supposed to eliminate all the bias, right? That's what we were told. So I found myself reciting the familiar Chicago refrain, and Simone brought this up the other day, that my house would be worth twice as much if I were on the north side of Chicago. So I have a son, his name is Carter, he's 2. And so I'm always thinking now with this investment, as many other people are, is what am I going to be able to leave for Carter? Am I going to be able to pay for college? Am I going to be able to give him money towards purchasing his first home to start his life? You know, I hope to be able to transfer wealth, which my grandparents couldn't do for my parents, and my parents really couldn't do for me. And while this is my story, what I'm telling you is not unique. There are hundreds of thousands of minority families that have had similar experiences and similar stories. And there are many whose experiences are much worse, that actually lost their homes and completely lost their equity. So when I think about these things and how many generations have been impacted, like Marvin Gaye, it makes me want to holler. So while many houses have been torn down, my grandparents' house is still standing. Zillow values it at $49,000. Redfin values it at $33,000.
Wow, wow, wow. Thank you for sharing that. I can only imagine. Well, I won't even say I can only imagine because I went through something similar with my parents' house. But the fact that your grandparents experienced this, and now you, and we're hoping that we don't have to pass these type of challenges on down to our children. But the way things are going right now, we just really don't know. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives. I definitely wanted to give each person an opportunity to speak to something that they are directly familiar with. Now I'll kind of just ask questions that anyone can answer. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois said, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Well, here we are in the 21st century, and it is still very much a problem. I wanted to let anyone who wants to speak to how race and racism play out in the housing counseling industry, particularly in relation to Black and white people, which is the type of, color line that we're all talking about most of the time, even though there's obviously other races. One thing that we mentioned the other day, and I want to give someone a chance to speak to it, is, have you heard of there being any particular challenges for white counselors working with Black clients? And if so, can you elaborate on that? And how would you recommend the white counselors deal with those challenges? Anyone could answer it. Raise your hand, something.
Well, I'll comment from the perspective of being a newer first-time homeowner. I remembered, I think I sat in probably a meeting room with a few of you folks there, and folks were talking and saying around the table, "Hey, when was the last time somebody tried to get a mortgage?" And how everything is automated or in these new online processes. And so I found myself on the market for my first home, and I'm in the District of Columbia, and we've got those really high prices, and hey, you own a piece of land here, a piece of property in DC, it's a good place to buy. But I had a very unique experience, a lot of questions in my purchase process of, hey, can your family gift you monies for closing costs or monies for down payment and those sort of options. And so I know there was a lot of conversation of reiteration, hey, whatever I've got is what I've got. That's how much house we're going to get. But I know that came up for a few folks in terms of what's the expectation here? Are we expecting our Black clients to be able to come to the table with the same offerings that we would expect from our white clients? And we know that just not to be true in terms of our access to credit and our access to resources to support the pursuit of homeownership. And so these are the sort of things that I know a few of us have talked offline about being mindful in conversation in terms of when we engage with clients and what our assumed biases. Are we asking everyone the same questions or not? Am I assuming that you have access to something that you don't? Am I being equitable in my service delivery, or am I bringing in those biases? And I think as people, we have a responsibility to be honest about how we show up or how we interpret things and how that plays out into our delivery of services. And so am I assuming that you don't have access to certain funds, and you maybe there is a gift or a trust or certain options that have been afforded to you, or am I overly pressing or communicating to you that, hey, you might not be in the best space to pursue homeownership because you don't have access to these options that I'm used to seeing from other folks. And so I know that's something that comes up. And then also, even just from a personal perspective, I am in a city that has gone through quite a bit of gentrification. And I know even moving into my neighborhood and community, my neighbors were surprised that I was Black. And a lot of my neighbors, you know, they're older, senior citizens. And I recognized only in that moment that the gentrification had caused a great concern for them in terms of their ability to maintain their housing and to age effectively in place. And so what people moving into their communities represented to them. And so representation in homeownership is critically important. Your role as a housing counselor, your role in executive leadership, and your messaging around creating equitable access and resources for all Americans to pursue the homeownership dream is absolutely viable and important. And it's something that we should continue to elevate. I mean, as Simone and many others have mentioned on this call, this is our form of activism. We talked about, and we've continued to talk about, the African-American homeownership rate and how it is as low as it was before the passage of the Fair Housing Act. We've got a responsibility in this work to continue to educate our clients about their rights, their protections, and to amplify and elevate these causes as much as we can while creating access.
And if I can piggyback on one thing that Ibi Joke said, and she brought up a really critical point, and Lee brought this up when we talked before too, about unconscious bias. The reality is most of us don't know, and I will give you an example for me. I sat in on a seminar about unconscious bias, and I remember I had the woman who was teaching it. You know, guys, I'm very spiritual. Like, I do a lot of personal and self-development. You can find me with a meditation, anything. If it's about elevating your higher self, I am there. I want to know everything. Yeah. So I was in this seminar, and they were talking to the Home Free team about unconscious bias, and I did not even realize that I was doing this, but I was like, oh yeah, talk to them. Talk to all those other people in the room. I was saying it to myself, but then I had to check myself. I'm like, girl, you got unconscious bias too. And it wasn't until she started going through and breaking down certain things, and I was like, well, damn, I got some unconscious bias right there myself. And I had to be super mindful of that. The fact that it was so buried, and we don't even necessarily think of, sometimes we think of unconscious bias as bad. It may not be bad. Like one thing I heard was that all Asians are good at math. No, they're not. No, and I don't even mean that in a bad way. It's just when you generalize and you stereotype a group of people to say that all of X is like this or all of Y is like that, that is what creates a problem. And I'm telling you, as somebody who had to really figure it out for myself, we all, every single one of us, have that unconscious bias, and we bring it to work. We bring it to life. We bring it everywhere. So again, going back to Ibi Joke's point, the very first thing that we can do is look within ourselves for what narratives am I assuming, what things, because I guarantee you, just as much as I had it, you had it, and I still have it. The only difference is that now I can check myself to say, girl, do you really know that that's the case for everybody? Or have you taken the time to ask the questions to figure out, you know, is this, and not assume one way or the other. So that's the only thing I wanted to add to that. That unconscious bias is real. And again, we show up every day with it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Simone. Go ahead, Lee.
I was just going to say, I was actually going to say the same thing Tamara said, but taking one step further, as a trainer, I come in contact with housing counselors and EVs all over the country. And I remember once a counselor came up to me and said, her executive director, and this is a white female counselor, her white female executive director would refer to their folks in the community as those people. And she was conscious enough to realize that was a problem because she immediately separated them from those people. And it seems like a small thing, but your actions then reflect your thoughts. So she was mindful enough, she brought that to my attention and actually pulled me aside and said, how do I deal with that? And so fortunately, her manager didn't counsel much. You know, it was like a rare thing. So, you know, I empowered her to just be mindful how she reacts and relates to people. But absolutely what Simone said is implicit bias. And I think Ellie has a resource for everyone because Harvard has a link where you can go and take different implicit bias tests, not just race, but there's implicit bias with regards to age and just all sexual orientation. And Jane Elliott, you know, a very famous race activist, said, you know, if you grow up in America, you're going to have some implicit bias. And the key, as Simone said, and I just want to echo it, is we have to check ourselves. You can't say, I don't have it, I don't see in color. You absolutely see in color, and you should. We should celebrate our differences. That's a beautiful thing. You don't want, everybody shouldn't be the same because we all bring something unique and exciting and beautiful to the table. But we should also know that our training in this country with the media the way it is, the policies, the systemic policies the way it is, and if you're unfamiliar with this space, I mean, there's so many things. The Color of Law is a good place to start. Read that, listen to the audiobook, start to understand the foundation of where this comes from, and then check yourself, because at the end of the day, all we can do is change who we are, and hopefully that light shines to other people.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much. Did anyone else want to talk to this topic before I move on to something else? Okie dokie. So I love we're having this conversation because a lot of the things that I was thinking about asking you all are kind of organically coming out in your responses to other questions. So I love that. One thing that I have learned or gained more of a respect for during this conversation is how vital housing counseling is really to the community in general, and that you really do it to kind of right society's wrongs, right? Especially in the areas of homeownership for Black people and other minority communities. What I wanted to ask is, a lot of times when we have situations like we have now in society where there's a lot of talk about race, there's a lot of talk about racism, there's a lot of talk about injustice and discrimination, et cetera, there are people, primarily white people, who don't want to say anything to their Black colleagues or their Black friends out of fear of saying the wrong thing, right? They say, well, we would say something, but if we say the wrong thing, they'll say we're racist. Or, you know, we don't want to insult anyone. But when you're working in this kind of work, you kind of have to have those hard conversations, right? You have to be able to have those conversations in order to get further, in order to get to the next step. So I wanted to ask whoever wants to answer this, how do you move past that fear? Or how would you recommend someone move past that fear to be able to have those conversations that are so necessary?
Okay, I'll start with a couple of different things. Again, I've had 25 conversations about race with white people in the last 3 weeks. So we've actually had these conversations. I'm like, when did I become this chick? But okay. It's all right. It's all right. I'd rather them have those conversations. And I invite that level of authenticity, but I had to start with myself as a Black person and being willing to really listen to what they were saying and not get caught up. And so I think we do have to pay attention. Now, one woman, I told her, this is a white woman, and I knew where her heart was, so I had no concerns about where she was coming from, but there were some things that I just shared with her from the perspective of being Black. For example, she talked about, we want to lead with love. And I was like, you're totally right. However, one thing that you want to realize is that Black people are dealing with intergenerational trauma. And so we're talking, intergenerational trauma can go back 7 generations. And it's something that I actually learned from her, but in a different context. And so I pointed that out, and I said, so you have to think about it. If we have been dealing with this, like you guys are waking up and you're like, oh my God, this is terrible. But this is literally our lives. This is what we deal with and have been dealing with for generations. So that means that our response may not always be perfect, you know, in the sense it may not be what you would consider as open or engaging or, you know, whatever. It doesn't fit the box. Because again, we are dealing with trauma and the traumatic effects of injustice and being subjugated for over 400 years. And that is so, and that was really my conversation with her. I was just like, look, I know your heart, I know where you're coming from, but you have to remember that when you're talking to people, and there are going to be people who say, I don't want to hear from you, and fine, that's their trauma showing up. But if you've got people like me and many others, I am not the only one, you've got me and many others that you're talking to, if you come from a space of love, from a space of I really want to know, I'm really interested in the experience, I was like, you're probably going to get people, well, you may get people who are willing to listen. And if you don't, and willing to answer these questions, and if you don't, it's okay. It's just that their trauma is indicating that I can't really talk to you about this right now. And that's all right too, but we have to understand that there is no one right thing or wrong thing to say. You are not talking to, there's no one right person, there is no one right response, there is nothing. It's just human to human interaction. And all we're doing, if you come to me in a spirit of love and genuinely like, I really do not know, I personally, Simone, and I'm only speaking for Simone, I am in the space where I can listen and I can receive and I can answer that. But you have to understand that there are many people who are not in that space and they deserve that too.
Absolutely. Thank you. David, go ahead, please.
Well, you know, I was thinking as Simone was talking, you know, for a Caucasian person, right, they rarely ever get the question of what do white people think? Whereas a person who is African American or Hispanic or Latinx gets that question all the time. And, you know, even in my office at Housing Action Illinois, we have more than one person of color, and we don't all agree on the same thing. So it sometimes becomes very difficult when you are presented with the I am the ambassador for the race question, right? So I think that for when people are asking questions, they have to be prepared to understand that Ibi Joke's opinion is Ibi Joke's opinion. David's opinion is David's opinion. And we are all, as Simone said, dealing with the trauma. We are dealing with it in different ways. But just because Ibi Joke says, this is the way I see it, doesn't mean that all the rest of us are going to see it that same way.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's an excellent.
Yes, I know we have some questions there. I just wanted to quickly chime in on this one as well and say that silence is very loud. I mean, you would be surprised that when you say nothing, just how much it speaks for your lack of support for a community, or just what that inaction may represent for the staff and the community that you work and serve in. And so I think really to your question, Tamara, it is an acknowledgement of white privilege and the differences. I mean, you know, some of the statistics, I think one of the most noticeable statistics that I've seen, it would take Black Americans 228 years to catch up with the wealth that white Americans have created. There's a privilege factor in that. And so we're not talking about equitable dynamics. And so a part of that is obviously long-term systemic racism and structures that have played out into this factor. But what you can do today as allies is show up and not allow this burden and this plight to be lifted only by Black voices. I know, you know, I know I'm not the only one that has been in a room and has said something and that has had a white colleague say the exact same thing, and it's reached more people. And so at the time, I think, you know, your voices are absolutely critical, needed, valued and appreciated, and no, there's no blanket approach. No, we're all not going to get it right because we're all human and we are not without flaws or without errors. But it definitely is a time that we show up for one another in the work that we do. We show up to amplify the issues of minorities, the issues of the Black community, as they're ever so present on the media in very traumatizing ways. But again, as I think we've all mentioned on this call, our work is activism, educating consumers on their rights and on their fair housing rights, hand-holding folks through complaint processes, filing these complaints with the CFPB when you notice something is coming up, even within your own organizational structures, communicating with your staff, elevating your voice with executive leadership, making certain that your staff is diverse and inclusive, because it really is through these diverse perspectives that you bring about the greatest work and the greatest source of collaboration. So I'll turn it back to you, Tim. I know we've got some questions.
Well, yeah, I actually was about to turn it over to Ellie because I know she's the one who's monitoring the chat and who wants to ask questions. So what are the questions that we have out there?
Hi, thanks so much, you guys. This has been an amazing conversation. I do want to make one comment coming from the place of a white person, that if you do take the time to speak with a Black colleague about what's happening and they're willing to speak to you, be prepared for whatever gets said. That it's not about you. It's anything that is said out of love, and take it for that, and try to learn. And then I would also encourage my white colleagues to educate themselves as much as possible. And you know, I'm hopeful that the resources that we are providing you all will help with some of that. There's so much more than what we've provided here. All you have to do is Google, and there's just a ton of things out there. So just a little bit of additional perspective I wanted to add on that question of what can we do as white people. So the first thing I want to say, there are a couple of people who have their hands raised, and I will unmute them, but I did want to get to a couple of the questions. So first of all, I just want to say somebody named Lisa Terry is saying hi to you, long time no see. She's with CCCS in Forsyth County in Wisconsin, I think, is WS. Anyway, somebody else mentions we need to be teaching budget and credit in high school as a required course. Another person comments, at some point, those that are less marginalized, moderate income, and white male will not be distracted by fear of a virus. Their projects and jobs will stabilize, and the din of truth that repeats can lose its power. We will all be distracted by the next emergency. What should be constructed in contracts, agreements, policy, investment now to ensure equity messaging is not lost in 18 months? That's the first question. Go ahead with that one.
Who wants to tackle that, Lee?
I'll add my 2 cents because I think for us to really have any real change, it has to start from the top down. And I said earlier, it needs to be, diversity and inclusion needs to be reflected at the C level of management as well as in the boards. And oftentimes, especially like you see it in your face with tech, because they've been called out recently, but in tech companies, the one Black person is the executive in charge of diversity and inclusion. And that's just not right. I mean, it's hard to really make policy around issues in your community if you don't have your members of the community at the table, period. That's just the fact. And having a homogenous board or homogenous upper management team is going to give you a very narrow perspective. And so to be inclusive, you need to start there. And that will affect your HR policies. Also, one thing I learned from my colleague, Audrey Blanche, who I spoke of earlier, she said, you know, when you're creating these policies, when you say, like, a policy like affirmative action, for instance, that always brings up, like, people get kind of like, I don't like affirmative action or whatever. And that's just a Band-Aid. That's not really the ideal policy, right? We just had to come up with something because the discrimination was so rampant. She said, look at it in terms of fairness for everybody. And here's an example that she gives, which I think is wonderful. The statistics show that in board members, white men tend to talk over minorities and women. And so their voices aren't heard, they're not respected or supported. And so they end up not contributing after some time. And so she's instilled at her organization a no interruption policy for their board members or for their staff meetings. And that's a small thing, but you can see how that can have a bigger impact over time as people of color and women start to speak out more and share their perspectives. And so couple that with a real intent to blind HR, HR policies, where you're really hiring people based on skill set and not based on who they know or what school they went to. Oftentimes jobs, especially even in our space, again, I'm always saying, look in the mirror. Even in our space, the task at hand doesn't necessarily require a college degree, does it? I mean, we train them on the job anyway. But look at our job posts. Oftentimes we put, we want a 4-year degree. Well, that can have a disparate impact on people of color, on immigrants, et cetera. And so we're cutting out a whole part of society that could be an excellent employee because they may have the capacity to learn and to show up for us in the way that we need to. So I really think that's the best place to start if we're going to look at long-term systemic change.
Thanks so much, Lee. When you start talking about D&I, I want to stop facilitating and jump in the conversation. But did anybody else want to respond to that question before Ellie asks another one?
The only thing I would add to that is that it's a very real threat that in 18 months, next month, we're not going to be talking about the same thing. And so we are going to have to keep this conversation going. We offered some amazing perspectives as to the way we do it. And I did listen to the link that was sent about that Audrey Blanche talked about, and it was really very interesting. But we have to keep this conversation going, and let's use this as a marker. Henceforth and forevermore, we are going to do whatever we can in our workplace and in our personal lives to ensure equity and inclusion across the board, because again, the pie is, we're expanding the pie, we're not further dividing it.
Thank you.
I would just quickly add in that policy absolutely is the way to having long-term systemic change. And so if we know that the scales are unbalanced, then we've got to come together as a community using the knowledge that we have as housing experts to say, well, how can we make this thing more equitable? What needs to happen to our access to credit or the way that we view it to consider certain things? So I would just say it's imperative that we stay engaged with our representatives, our local, our state and our federal representatives, and that we are participating in this process. I know a number of our agencies, we sign on to various letters, but we also, as leaders in this field, want to hear from you guys. We want to hear those calls to actions about what we can be advocating for and elevating as higher level concerns from a policy perspective with members of Congress as well. So I would just toss that out there as a point.
Thanks so much. Is there another question, Ellie?
Yeah, so I'm going to ask this question, and then I'm going to go to the people who have their hands raised. So this question is about the terms used. So the person mentioned that she heard Black, she heard people of color, she heard African American, and is just wondering, is there a specific term that is better, or is there more likely something that should be avoided?
I think this goes into David's point about people are different. Yeah, this goes into David's point about people are different. I resonate with Black, and a lot of people that I know resonate with Black, and they feel like Black is all inclusive. It is inclusive of Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Latinos, people from Africa, just anybody who's got complexion, mine or darker. It's an inclusive type of deal. But I'm not at all, again, this is where we get into not speaking for someone else, because there are others who really resonate. And then I personally look at Barack Obama as an African American. His father was African, his mother was American. I look at myself as Black. So that, but again, this is Simone's perspective. I cannot speak for others.
I agree with Simone on that. Black, I like the term Black. As she said, it's inclusive of all, Caribbean, all immigrants from wherever. And so I resonate strongly with Black. I think it's a great term. Thanks.
Do you want to say something, if you're okay?
I was saying perhaps you can help us here. Have some pulling off your facilitator hat. I thought you might have a valuable.
You want me to pull the hat off? No, you already know I'm a fan of Black as well. Like Simone said, I'm not a fan of people of color at all. I feel like it's trying to homogenize a group of people and make certain people more comfortable talking about race instead of talking about the specific people they want to talk about. But that's my perspective, and I'm not a panelist. So I'll let y'all, if anybody else wanted to answer that before we move on to the people that have their hands raised.
Great question, and I think it's also very appropriate to ask the person on what they would prefer to be referred as. But I will say that I personally don't find any of the names that you've used as offensive, Black or African American. But we'll agree that when you're referring to people of color, that is inclusive of a larger branch of folks. I mean, you're including Hispanics, you're including Asians into that subset as well. And sometimes when you're talking about issues that impact a particular group, it's really important to give a thing a name or denote or refer to a group by their name specifically. And so in this instance, I would suggest Black and African American as being some of the more appropriate options.
Great. So I am going to, Danielle Harris, I'm sorry if I didn't say your first name right. Danielle Harris, you have your hand up. I'm going to unmute you. So Danielle, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me, guys?
We can.
Hi, how are you? First of all, I had thrown a question in because I didn't think that she was going to be able to answer my hand raising. This is a phenomenal panel. I'm so proud that we have housing counselors and directors that are leaders. You guys are amazing. And this was so needed. This was so needed during this time. Angela knows I love her. We've been working together for many, many years, and I'm so excited about this. But my question was, now that we have this new normal and we're going back into this situation, remember, we have to go back in safely, obviously. We also have to make sure we understand that we have new clients coming in and we have clients with major hardships. From you guys' perspective, how would you handle that for counselors going forward? And how would you deal with the new transitions when we do go back into our offices and working with our clients and actually doing seminars and teaching and going forward?
Who would like to answer that first? Anyone?
Well, I do want to dominate. I feel like I was hoping Eva Joke was going to jump in. But I would say as leaders, as housing counseling leaders, it's going to be really important that you're not shy away, that you know, maybe even start right away with a Zoom call with your staff and saying, hey, let's have the hard conversation internally. Let's go ahead and let's see how we as a smaller, you know, microcosm of our community, you know, what challenges and opportunities, right, do we have to educate one another? And then I would also look at, I know Ellie's going to be providing you with some additional resources. And of course, this is if you want to go into this space. If you don't, there are professionals and consultants who already do this work who are really experienced, and you may want to collaborate with them. But if you decide that at your agency, well, regardless, I think you should do it internally. But if you decide that that's going to be something that you engage your community in, I would invite you to look at some of the tools to help you better facilitate those conversations, especially around race, because they can get very heated. I had the pleasure of living in South Africa for a short time, and they do a thing they call Consciousness Cafe, and they have a white person and a black person facilitate a training with a diverse group, and they talk about race issues. And I thought, how enlightening. I wish we did this back home, right? Because this is where, you know, because we were so like, oh, we can't talk about it. It doesn't exist. We know it exists, but we're not going to talk about it. And they're very open about it. They understand that this has been an issue for their country, and they're tackling it head on. And so I'm really like excited to see these conversations happening, because I think really this is the only way we heal and grow. And so I would hope that as leaders you would want to kind of take this on, because like I think it was Simona Ibejoke, we are advocacy. This is the work we do. So we're in a unique position to have access to people in our community and to really be able to affect some change. We absolutely have to keep it in the forefront. And if we utilize some of the tools that we'll be sharing with you, or that maybe you can partner, and I'm big into community collaboration, so I highly recommend find somebody in your community who does it well and maybe learn from them, and then you can facilitate together until you get really comfortable with it. But yes, please, please, please take that on. And there was one thing I just wanted to share from a previous conversation with regards to what white people can do. And I think as a black person in this space, I think it's important for us, especially if we're open to the discussion. And again, not all of us are. We feel the trauma in very different ways. But if we're open to the discussion, let our friends know. Because they love us, and they may not want to hurt our feelings, and don't know that asking those questions could hurt our feelings. So one of the things I posted, I'm a big social media person, I posted this on my page, and I'll be very brief. It says, I am also an ally. If any one of my white friends is struggling with finding a way to navigate the space of understanding implicit bias, systemic racism, police brutality, racial issues in general, I am here for you. We can only solve these issues as a united front. I love you, and I am here. P.S. Although I'm not an expert, I'm looking to educate myself how I can better facilitate these discussions, and would be open to serving on boards of directors who have 100% commitment to fairness and unity. Because I don't want to be that one token person on the board and they're not trying to listen. If I get on the board, you best know you're going to hear everything I got to share, but I'm going to ask that you bring me in a supportive way and support the work I'm doing, and then we need to put pen to paper. I need to see some changes if you really committed to it. It's no more that, oh yeah, we got Lee, so we're diverse. No, we're going to be doing some other things. But I'm open to having that discussion, and I'm pretty sure that there are other folks in the community who are too. You just have to ask them. So don't shy away. All right, I'm done. Soapbox is over.
No worries.
Okay. So I do have another hand raised. I just want to let people know it doesn't have to be a question. Maybe you just want to share your thoughts. That's okay too. So if you'd like to do that, again, raise your hand in the toolbox, and I will go to you. So I see Nancy Macleod has her hand raised. So I am going to unmute you, Nancy. Are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear
Go
me
ahead.
okay? All
We
right.
hear you.
So I'm a white housing counselor, and most of my clients are Black clients, a few Latino clients, and some Asian clients. And I work in an agency providing mortgage default counseling. And of course, the first step in all of that for me is the budget. And what I found is that it's very, very important when I first meet with a client just to establish a person-to-person contact, that I'm a person here, I'm working with you. I don't have all the answers. I don't know everything about you. Here's a little bit about me, but we're going to work together. We're going to try to solve your problem. So I've learned that I need to, especially if somebody's of a different culture, I need to ask them a little bit about, in your culture, how is money managed? In your family, how is money managed? And not everybody manages their money the same way, so that's critical. Also, not to make any judgments, because people come in and they look at me and they think, well, you're going to think badly of me because I don't have a credit card or I don't have a bank account. But that's not true, because my goal is to go where you are. And if there's small steps that we can take together to move you forward so that we're stabilizing you in your home, that's important. So it's important for them to trust me and me to trust them, that I'm not taking over their life. I'm not taking over their money. I'm not taking over their problem. I'm just there to work with them to solve it. So that's the approach that I've been using. And my clients feel like, well, they can talk to me, you know, if I'm stepping on their toes, they're going to let me know. And I appreciate that.
I love that.
Thank you so much for sharing.
I think it's great that you have a conversation acknowledging, hey, what is your relationship with money? I mean, you know, what is your family or your cultural experience with that? Because it really, there's no blanket approach. I mean, you can talk about lending circles or susus, if you will, depending on where a person comes from. A lot of people not either trusting the banking system and not having, you know, the traditional accounts that, you know, may be required or needed in particular transactions. So it's absolutely a great approach to turn it in and really pull that information from a client instead of making those assumptions. Hey, what's your relationship and experience with, what's your practice?
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's incredibly important because, as we know, we're dealing with a more and more diversified America. And the reality is the way white Americans deal with money could be different from the way Black Americans, but it's also different from the way Latinos deal with money, and then Indians, and not just deal with money, but also the approach, our money story, what we think about it. We may be buying a home. Well, some of us may be buying a home just for ourselves. There are many people who are buying a home for their parents and grandparents and their children who are coming in. And it is not for anybody to say, well, look, you need to make this about you. That is an insult to their culture, to say that you need to just be buying for yourself. No, they're coming together to figure out how can we buy to have a multi-generational setup in here. That's perfectly fine, but we would not know that if the questions are not asked. So I applaud you for really just jumping in and saying, what do I need to know that I don't tell me your money story, which is great.
Tamara, I would, you know, Simone just mentioned about the differences between how people treat money. You know, my wife and I treat money differently, so we know that it can happen, you know, in different households. I think about the foreclosure crisis that we aren't far away from, and some of the things that have happened since then. And that we know that for a lot of homeowners that were faced with default, it felt like it was a personal failure, like they did something wrong. So it is not surprising that when someone comes in for assistance, that they're going to feel defensive because they are prepared, because they've heard this before, where someone says, well, you shouldn't have done this, or you shouldn't have done that. Well, if that high interest, high fee mortgage was the only thing available to them at that time, what other choice did they have? So having this person, you know, meet them where they are, ask questions, and give them an opportunity to express their fear, their frustration, their hopes, and to work with them to build on that is extremely important. And I would just want to emphasize for everyone else that's on this call and everybody that you speak to about the call that you participated in is that you need in these sessions to not walk in with preconceived notions. And if you can avoid those preconceived notions, then you are really going to be in a position to help your consumer. And then, you know, just one other thing that I wanted to say very quickly is about technology. One of the things that we are learning because of this is we as an industry have quickly shifted to working from home, right? And we have we're seeing increases across the board in terms of the number of people that are calling us looking for service, and we are able to meet that demand. And what I would say for a lot of us, that when the office opens back up, that we actually aren't all going to go back to the office. We will use this opportunity and the technology that is available to us now to better meet people where they are, even in their physical locations, to help them to achieve their goals, whether it is a nice apartment, a new home, saving their home, whatever it is. The technology is going to be available for us to better meet people where they are.
I love that. I love that. Excellent point. Is there another question, Ellie?
Yeah, I think that this is the perfect question to kind of wrap up our conversation and to follow what David just said. As a community development industry, where do we go from here to ensure that financial, real estate, and insurance industries are tied into the values and policies that we would like to see realized on a state and national level? Should we develop a policy paper in these times that underscores the issues that we see and offer solutions with best practices that show how to minimize the wealth income gap, entrepreneurship, local development initiatives that highlight the benefits of communities, persons of color?
Well, I think that there are there are a lot of policy papers that are out there. There are a lot of studies. Just the study that I mentioned at the top of this conversation about the lending in Chicago between 2012 and 2018. And even with that, we had agencies within the federal government that said, let's change CRA because we don't need to hold banks to such a high standard anymore. So I think that while I don't necessarily know what the answer is going to be, is that the approach has to be quite different. One, to keep this first and foremost in people's minds, and that we're going to have to rely on something different than a policy paper, because all of the papers that we have done over the last 20, 25 years, we are still not making the progress that we need to see happen.
Yeah, so I just want to add something to the conversation around, David spoke about it might not be policy. So one of the things that we're seeing, and Simone spoke about that earlier, about being locked out of the market. So the person included real estate in this. And what we're seeing is that when minority homeowners go out to buy a house and they're using an FHA loan, right? They're getting told that no, the homeowner doesn't want to sell to someone using an FHA loan. So, while we are pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps, we have the 3 jobs, we're trying to, achieve the American dream, we're still being shut out. And we know there's a Fair Housing Act. How do we speak to these real estate people to say that, that's not fair, you're not doing the right thing, right? You're showing your bias, right? And this is still discrimination, because are you going to say you can't allow someone with an FHA loan? So they're still steering, and I think they're advising homeowners not to sell to minorities, especially if we're moving out into the suburbs, which we know is predominantly white, and now we're in those neighborhoods and they don't want to sell to you. But FHA loans are guaranteed, right? And to help minorities to buy homes. So how do we deal with that? Is it policy that we need? Because I know policies out there, but do we need more policy around that? So maybe the panel. Thanks.
So I have a few thoughts about this. I started my career as a mortgage banker, and I was fortunate to work for an organization that actually was really focused on helping low-income people. But even in doing that, I had a lot of colleagues who were just about how many loans they could rack up and how much they could charge people. And it made me sick to my stomach, I'll be honest. While a mortgage banker, I got training in being a housing counselor because I wanted to better serve my community. And I said all that to say, I don't think we always need to look to change other people. I think sometimes, again, we can look internally. We have CDFI. we can create programs and policies that serve our communities that are then accountable to our communities without having to worry about always getting the big banks to do it. And if we pull our money from the big banks and we start putting them in our local CDFI and other financial institutions, credit unions that serve our community, then guess what? They'll start changing their programs that to be suited to us because they're going to want to go after the money. So it's kind of like what Tyler Perry said, let's not keep asking for scraps from somebody else's table. Let's build our own table. And we have the tools. There's an organization out of, I want to say it's Michigan, that looked at, payday loans. Payday loans serve a purpose. As much as we as counselors like, oh no, you can't get a payday loan, we should be asking the question, why do they feel they need one? And what the organization did out of, I think it's Michigan, so don't quote me, I think it's out of Michigan, they created an alternative to payday loans so that people could still have the product, because look, the market was asking for the product. People would have the product, but not at the same rate. So then we can make, and they actually mandate counseling with it. So they're getting financial literacy training as well as getting a better rate on a payday loan. And so they're getting that immediate cash that they need, but they're learning how to build up reserves so they can have savings and no longer have to depend on it. But again, we really have to look at what can we do within our own communities? What infrastructures can we put in place or start to put in place now? And CDFIs are already there. We just really need to go to them and talk to them. I've talked to quite a few executive directors who don't look at CDFIs as partners, and to me, that's a travesty. And some organizations, they get it, right? That they even have their own mortgage division. That's separate, of course, but it's part of that nonprofit. So they make sure their clients are being well taken care of. So that's just my 2 cents. I think we just need to start with how can we build from, I don't expect us to have another Tulsa, so we can rebuild.
Yeah, and I'd like to piggyback on what Lee said and also notice that 3 people have come up with 3 different responses, and they're all correct, and there are probably 300 more responses that can be done. And so, and again, my suggestion is that to add, it's not to say, it's not a yes, but to add to that, if you have an understanding and you really share on the ground, however you do it, the how and why. Why is this important? And how in your sphere of influence, how you see this, happening. And I mean, for me, I'm focused on closing the racial wealth gap. I am focused on helping people build wealth, especially Black people, but not exclusively Black people. So how do I do that? Why? And so everything that I do now is a discussion of why is it important to people who may not be my avatar, my ideal client, why is it just as important to them that all these Black people build wealth? It is important to them. It is, I mean, they really need it because the more people build wealth, the more money they spend. And if they're spending, then they're buying over here and over here, they're buying houses, they're buying cars, they're buying clothes, they're traveling, they're doing this, that, or the other. But we do not, so we don't have that contribution to the economic society of which America is based on. America is purely based on capitalism. We don't have that contribution to capitalism if there are too many of us that are not paid our worth, that are not able to save, that don't know, that are being discriminated against when they're doing the legitimate right thing of trying to buy a house and move their family up the economic ladder. So for me, and it goes into what Lee said, I am taking everything to a personal level by any time I see a roadblock that I know I have the capacity to at least help break down. I am doing that through having the how and why discussion, why it's important to someone else that this roadblock be broken down, and then work with them to do it.
Thank you so much, Simone. Oh, were you going to talk, Angela? Who was talking?
That's Evie joking.
Oh, okay.
I think as a representative from a national organization, people are always asking, like, what are the national leaders that you guys are looking to for, when it comes to policy or just any of those things? And my response is I'm looking at the local housing counseling agencies always. And so I think that there isn't a blanket approach. Just as Simone suggested, I think even if we just look at the isolated issue of addressing affordable housing, the affordable housing needs of a rural community in a metropolitan area are different. And so what each community needs to thrive and advance that cause and issue will look differently. And so I think even with all that we said, you know, there's obviously much work for us to do, but a lot of that work is on the ground with your own organizations and being involved and invested in your community processes. What works in your community may work in others and may be able to be replicated, but it can't work if it doesn't start. And so I think I turn your question back on you and saying, what does your community need? How can you work with your city officials to implement it? How can you work with other community organizations to get it off the ground? Is it going great? How can we replicate this in other communities? Is this something that can be replicated regionally, or are there aspects of this that we can pull out as your national partners and elevate it to that particular scale? So that would be my suggestion on that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was the last question, right, Ellie?
It was. I do want to kind of wrap up a little bit. Is there anything that you want to say to wrap up, Tamara?
I just really wanted to thank all of our panelists and our participants for joining us today. It was a very robust conversation, and I'm very appreciative of that. One of the goals we have for this call was for everyone to leave with some real actions that they can take back to their work and their communities, and I hope that we have accomplished that goal. And just wanted to ask any of the panelists if they had one final thought they wanted to put out there. If not, thank you so much for your participation. If you have a final thought, you can go ahead, raise your hand, get it out there.
Well, I'd like to say thank you. I'd like to say thank you to Bruce and Ellie and Melody for putting this on. I think this is a really great conversation. I learned a lot as well. And so again, really a lot of thanks to you guys for doing this. The only thing that I would add, which I really just said before, but I just want to reiterate, is that without moving forward on an economic level for all people of color, Black people, Latinos, everybody, women, and which is not a person of color, but you know, without moving forward in all these different demographics, we all as a nation lose. There is no, this is not, you're just doing a good thing. You're doing the right thing for a Black person. No. You are, by us moving up the economic ladder, you are moving up the economic ladder. This is not just a social justice. Yes, it is the right thing to do, but it's also going to benefit everybody in America when we all have the seat that we have earned at the table. And you're not giving anybody anything. Nobody's being given anything. We're all working for this. We're just asking, we just know we are demanding a level of equality in our pay, equality in our representation, equality in every single thing that we do. If we do something wrong, we'll certainly be reprimanded for it, but we don't think we should be reprimanded any more than anybody else would be reprimanded for it. So this is not asking for something more than what anybody else is being given. So again, just thank you guys. Just always remember that the conversation is about how we're all growing. And this is one of the ways that everybody grows.
Thanks so much, Simone. Anyone else?
I also want to thank Bruce, Ellie, and Melody, and thank you, Tamara, for hosting. I have learned a lot from the panelists on here today, and I'm definitely have some takeaways that I am going to go back to my ED with, and see how we can also continue to advance the conversation around equality. And I just want to leave with one little thing that says, until the basic human rights are equally guaranteed to one and all, we will never have progress. So we really need to continue the conversation, advance the conversation, the policies to make that become reality. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela. Anyone else?
I would just say that we are a community with the shared interest of housing counseling. And so as we work to navigate these challenging times and even to advance and elevate our work to support these communities keep in mind that you've got a home base for that. And so you're not without resources. The National Housing Resource Center is obviously here, and as are the leaders that are on this call today. And so I think we all are open to providing support and resources, but we all are in the same thought and space that we've got a lot of work to do. And thank you all for all of your hard work. It's appreciated.
Thanks, Okay. I guess you can just take us out, Ellie.
Great. Well, I want to be clear that we did not kick David Young off of the call. He needed to go for a 2:30 call, so we did not kick him out. I just want to say thank you to all of you and to all of the people who asked questions and participated. This has been really great. I've learned stuff. I learn stuff every day from all of you anyway, and so I feel really lucky that I have you all as resources. So thank you again. And Bruce, is there anything you wanted to say today before we sign out?
I just think what an excellent conversation, and thank you for both the team that presented and the people who participated. This is obviously an important and valuable conversation. We really appreciate all the good work that you are doing, and it'd be helpful to hear what you think next steps would be helpful to in the future. So keep that rolling. We want to figure out how to have a positive role in all this. So Ellie, do you want to talk about what our next call will be?
Sure. So next week we are going to have we're going to go back to our kind of regularly scheduled programming, and we're going to do a session on taxes and insurance after forbearance. We've changed the title a little bit from what the PowerPoint says, and we've changed it to Forbearance 2.0, Taxes and Insurance. So that'll be next week. We have Lisa Sipkin from National Housing Law Project who will be on, and we're inviting servicers, Mr. Cooper, Wells Fargo, and Auckland to participate to let us know what they're doing with their borrowers around escrow issues. So hopefully you can participate and look for the registration link that'll go out with the recording of this webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.